Sandra Bullock stepped into the luxury jewelry store, quiet and unassuming. Dark jeans, a black turtleneck, elegant in its simplicity. Across the room, Margaret Winchester, draped in white fur and glittering diamonds, narrowed her eyes. "Are they letting just anyone in now?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on Sandra's understated look. Sandra didn't react, but silence has a way of making arrogance echo louder. Then the door chimed. A man in a black jacket stepped in, his presence effortlessly commanding. Keanu Reeves scanned the room, his eyes landing on Sandra. A small smile formed. Margaret had no idea that the lesson she was about to learn would come from one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. What happened next turned into a scandal no one saw coming. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Sandra Bullock entered the luxury jewelry store in Beverly Hills without drawing attention. Her steps were steady, her posture relaxed. Well-fitted dark jeans, a black turtleneck, minimal makeup and loose hair. No flashy jewelry, just a discreet watch and a simple belt. The environment around her breathed opulence. Gleaming display cases showcased rare diamonds. Impeccably dressed attendants guided high-profile clients through exclusive collections. Polite whispers blended with the occasional clink of jewelry being handled. Sandra moved between the displays, observing every detail without hurry. A salesperson walked past her without offering assistance, not out of rudeness, but because in this space where luxury is treated as a symbol of status, a woman dressed so simply could go unnoticed. On the other side of the store, Margaret Winchester examined a diamond necklace. She was the opposite of Sandra in every way. A pristine white fur coat, perfectly manicured nails, jewelry shimmering under the store's golden lights. Her exclusive handbag rested on her forearm like a trophy. The expensive perfume announced her presence before she even spoke. Margaret lifted the necklace against the light, evaluating the piece as if judging a work of art. Her companion stood beside her in silence, waiting for her opinion. Then Margaret saw Sandra. Her gaze locked onto the jeans, the plain black sweater with no logo, the absence of any ostentatious display of wealth. Something in her expression hardened. She tilted her head slightly and whispered to her friend, not caring if anyone heard, "Are they letting just anyone in now? Look at those jeans and a black sweater. Does she think she's at Target?" Her friend smirked slightly but said nothing. A few jewelry store employees, more attentive, caught the remark and exchanged quick glances. Sandra heard it, but she didn't react. She simply continued browsing the jewelry display, a small smile on her lips. Her calmness, her complete lack of need to justify herself or respond, made Margaret's jab feel even more hollow. But Margaret wasn't done. She adjusted her coat over her shoulders and stepped forward, determined to ensure that her opinion was heard. What she didn't know was that this would be one of the greatest lessons of her life. The atmosphere in the jewelry store shifted subtly as Margaret decided that merely ignoring Sandra Bullock was not enough. Her sharp gaze scanned Sandra from head to toe, taking in every detail of her simple attire. Dark jeans, a black turtleneck, loose hair without any elaborate styling, minimal makeup. Margaret felt an unfamiliar irritation rise in her chest. What is a woman dressed like that doing here? She held the diamond necklace in her hands, letting the piece slip through her fingers as she admired her own reflection in the glass display. The sparkle of the jewels matched the gleam of her vanity. The woman beside her, a brunette with her hair in a perfectly styled bun, noticed Margaret's change in demeanor and leaned in slightly. Something wrong? Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and murmured, still watching Sandra, "Are they letting just anyone in now? Look at those jeans and a black top. Does she think she's at Target?" She made no effort to keep her voice low. The comment was meant to be heard. Her friend smirked, not fully committing to the sentiment, but clearly intrigued by the contrast. Her gaze also lingered on Sandra, as if trying to understand why a woman who doesn't flaunt wealth walks into this store with such ease. A store associate, previously focused on arranging an exclusive collection of watches, glanced up discreetly. He exchanged a quick look with another employee behind the counter, both subtly assessing the situation. No one intervened. And Sandra? She heard, of course she did, but she didn't react. Without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement, she kept her gaze on the jewelry display in front of her, tracing the fine details of sapphire and diamond rings resting on velvet cushions. Her expression remained unreadable, calm, composed. This indifference bothered Margaret more than any reaction would have. A slight sneer tugged at the corners of Margaret's lips. Had Sandra snapped back, at least there would be something to work with. But ignoring her, as if her words carried no weight, that, to Margaret, was an insult in itself. She adjusted the pristine white fur coat draped over her shoulders and took a step forward, determined to reaffirm her superiority. This time, she didn't whisper. She spoke loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Oh, sweetheart, are you lost? The costume jewelry section is in the mall next door." This time, the effect was immediate. The air around them seemed to freeze for a moment. A few employees exchanged uncertain glances. A customer who had been examining a gold bracelet paused and subtly tilted his head. The sales associate who had ignored Sandra now watched the unfolding scene intently, holding a tray of diamond earrings, as if waiting to see how this would play out. Sandra didn't move immediately. She blinked slowly, absorbing Margaret's words without any urgency to respond. Her expression remained unshaken, as serene as if the remark had been nothing more than an idle observation. Then, in a deliberately unhurried motion, she slid her fingers across an emerald ring inside the display, and without looking at Margaret, offered the faintest smile. She turned away, not to reply, but simply to observe another showcase, making it clear that Margaret was not worth her attention. The gesture was subtle but powerful. The tension in the room tightened. Margaret blinked quickly, caught off guard. Was that dismissal? Sandra Bullock, the woman who was clearly dressed more modestly than anyone in the store, just disregarded her completely. A warm flush of irritation crept up Margaret's chest. She had expected a reaction, perhaps sarcasm, maybe embarrassment, or even a defensive response. But being ignored as if her words meant nothing? That, more than anything, infuriated her. She needed to regain control of this space. But before she could open her mouth to say anything else, another voice cut through the silence. Deep, steady, casual, yet carrying a weight that commanded attention. "Funny, I was just thinking that class has nothing to do with expensive jewelry." The weight of those words lingered in the air. The silence in the jewelry store shifted once more. This time it was heavier. Margaret felt a shiver crawl down her spine. Before she even turned to see who just spoke, the employees, once hesitant, now looked directly toward the store's entrance. A customer who had been about to leave paused, slightly tilting his head in the direction of the voice. Even without seeing who it was, Margaret sensed that something had changed. Her pulse quickened slightly, but she didn't know why. With a mixture of irritation and curiosity, she turned slowly, and then she saw him. The words lingered in the air like a quiet thunder. "Funny, I was just thinking that class has nothing to do with expensive jewelry." The effect was immediate. The quiet murmurs of sales associates assisting their wealthy clients faded. The room became more alert, more charged. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Before she even turned around, there was something about that voice, deep, steady, effortlessly commanding. It wasn't loud, it didn't seek attention, but it held it anyway. The employees who had previously pretended not to notice the growing tension between Sandra and Margaret now looked directly toward the entrance. A few customers, once absorbed in their selections of luxury jewelry, now shifted their focus, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Sandra, however, didn't look surprised. She would recognize that voice anywhere. Margaret turned slowly, and then she saw a tall man dressed in a black jacket and leather boots had just entered the jewelry store. His posture was relaxed, as if he were simply passing through without a care, yet his presence shifted the energy in the room. He wasn't adorned with symbols of status. He wasn't wearing the sharp suits favored by the men around him. He didn't flaunt designer brands or anything that screamed exclusivity, and yet he drew more attention than anyone else in the store. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, not in recognition, not yet, but because of something she couldn't quite name. The employees stood up a little straighter. A few customers, once lost in their own world of luxury, were now openly watching him. A hushed murmur rippled through the room. That's when Margaret realized this man was not just anyone. Margaret narrowed her eyes. There was something familiar about him. His sharp features, the dark hair, the effortless presence, the way the people around her were reacting. Her stomach dropped as the pieces began to click into place. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. His name exploded in her mind like a bolt of lightning. She felt her face heat up, her shoulders tense as her pride wrestled with the truth in front of her. Because if that's Keanu Reeves, then Sandra Bullock is not just any woman wearing jeans and a black turtleneck. Margaret's stomach knotted. A cold, hot wave washed over her. She had just insulted one of Hollywood. The weight of that realization settled heavily on her. Keanu adjusted the collar of his jacket, unhurried. His gaze flickered to Sandra briefly, a quiet understanding passing between them. Then he turned his attention to Margaret. The moment lasted only a second, but it was enough. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. Because the weight of his gaze, calm but filled with meaning, hit Margaret like an invisible blow. There was no open judgment, no look of superiority, but there was something worse. The undeniable truth. Margaret realized in that instant that Keanu already knew exactly who she was. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need an explanation. He saw what happened, he heard, and his expression said everything. He was not impressed. Margaret's throat went dry. For the first time, she felt the urge to step back. The employees, now fully aware of who had just walked in, subtly shifted their demeanor. A sales associate, who had previously hesitated to assist Sandra, now straightened his tie and suddenly looked much more attentive. Customers glanced at one another, some whispering under their breath, "Oh my God, is that Keanu Reeves?" Another nodded in silent shock. "And he's with Sandra Bullock!" The jewelry store, once filled with people focused only on their extravagant purchases, now had a singular point of focus, the unfolding scene in front of them. Margaret took a slow breath, trying to regain her composure. But the truth was, inside, she felt like she'd just taken a direct hit to the stomach. Her mind raced. She needed to say something, a comment, a witty remark, something to turn this around. But for the first time in a long time, she had nothing. Because there was nothing she could say. The silence around her was deafening. She blinked rapidly, looking at Sandra. The actress's expression remained the same, calm, unbothered, as if she had known all along that no words were necessary. And for Margaret, that was the worst part. Keanu finally offered a small smile, but not at Margaret. He turned to Sandra and his tone shifted completely. "Sandy, that necklace would look perfect on you." The silence in the store deepened. The employees held their breath. The customers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Margaret felt her stomach drop even further. The weight of the moment lingered. The jewelry store, once filled with polite conversations and refined transactions, now felt heavy with unspoken tension. The employees exchanged discreet glances. The customers, though trying to appear indifferent, could not ignore the scene unfolding before them. Margaret felt it too, something she was not used to feeling. For years she had commanded rooms like this. She had always been the one to dictate who deserved attention and who did not. She had never been the one who needed to prove herself. But here stood Sandra Bullock, who never even acknowledged her provocations, and Keanu Reeves, who just turned the entire situation into a silent reckoning. Margaret felt heat rise to her face, but she refused to back down. She would not leave this room defeated. Adjusting her pristine white fur coat over her shoulders, she lifted her chin. If Keanu thought he could shift the dynamic against her with a single remark, he was sorely mistaken. She turned to Sandra, her voice deliberately polite but laced with underlying venom. Women like us need to maintain a certain standard. She trailed her fingers over her diamond necklace, letting the store's light catch the brilliance of the stones. The meaning was clear. Margaret was trying to remind her of her place. But Sandra didn't flinch. No change in expression, no sign of discomfort, nothing. Just an unreadable gaze, as if she were watching a predictable scene from a movie she had seen too many times before. Then Keanu finally stepped closer. If his presence had been a looming shadow in the background before, he was now the undeniable center of attention. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every step he took carried an unspoken weight that Margaret could not ignore. And then he did something she never expected. Keanu looked directly at Sandra and said, without hesitation, "Bullock, that necklace would look perfect on you." The impact of his words was immediate. If the silence had been heavy before, it was now suffocating. Margaret felt her stomach sink. What did he just call her? Bullock. Not Sandra Bullock, the name that needs no introduction. That one simple detail made Margaret realize her mistake in the worst possible way. She hadn't just tried to belittle an ordinary woman. She had attempted to humiliate Sandra Bullock, and now Keanu Reeves was standing by her side. The employees realized this too. The sales associate who had hesitated to assist Sandra now straightened immediately, adopting a far more professional demeanor. Customers whispered among themselves. They know each other. Oh my God, she really tried to put down Sandra Bullock? Unbelievable. Margaret felt the humiliation tightening around her like a noose. She had always been the most mofiji. Margaret was not one to give up easily. She had always had a way of twisting situations in her favor. This wouldn't be any different. Forcing a smile, she turned to Keanu and responded, her voice light, as if she were choosing to play along. You're right, Keanu. True luxury isn't just about what we wear. But let's be honest, a little refinement never hurt anyone. She spoke with a casual tone, as if she were agreeing without actually admitting defeat. But Keanu didn't take the bait. He simply looked at her with that same calm, steady gaze that seemed to see right through everything. And then he said something that completely broke Margaret's composure. You know, I've always found it funny how some people try to seem superior, but in the end, what really matters is how we treat others. This time there was no pretending it didn't hit her. The words landed like a direct hit. Margaret felt the sting of embarrassment deep inside her. The employees watched her carefully, waiting for her reaction. The customers exchanged knowing glances, barely hiding their amusement. And Sandra? Sandra smiled. Not a smug smile, not a victorious smirk, just a simple, effortless smile. And that was worse. The weight of Keanu's words was unbearable. She could feel the way people were looking at her, the silent judgment. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't know what to say. Her face burned, her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She could try to defend herself. She could make a sharp remark. But what was left to say? The truth was already clear. She had lost. Lost. Margaret Winchester, the woman who always controlled the narrative, now had no control at all. Her white fur coat, once a symbol of her sophistication, now felt suffocating. She needed to leave. Sandra, without the slightest hesitation, turned to the sales associate and said, her voice steady and calm, "I'll take that necklace." There was no question, no uncertainty. The saleswoman, now entirely focused on her, nodded and moved quickly to package the piece. Keanu simply crossed his arms, casting an unreadable glance at Margaret. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She had never felt so small. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out, gripping her phone. She needed to escape this moment, but deep down she knew this humiliation would not be forgotten. Margaret walked out of the jewelry store quickly, the sharp sound of her heels echoing against the polished marble floor. Her heart pounded, and she gripped her phone tightly. She felt like everyone was still watching her, even after she'd left. The crisp Beverly Hills air hit her face, but it did nothing to cool the heat burning her cheeks. She had always been in control of situations like this. She had always had the last word. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt utterly powerless. She walked aimlessly down the sidewalk, trying to process what just happened. The humiliation, Keanu's quiet but commanding presence, the way Sandra never reacted to her provocations and yet still won. Margaret unlocked her phone and scrolled through social media, flicking through posts mindlessly, but nothing held her attention. Everything felt trivial now. Keanu's words echoed in her mind. What really matters is how we treat others. She clenched her jaw. She wanted to dismiss it, wanted to convince herself that it was just an incident, a misunderstanding. But deep down she knew. She knew she was wrong, and she knew that everyone in the store saw it too. As Margaret walked away, the atmosphere inside the jewelry store shifted. The customers who had been engrossed in the unfolding scene gradually returned to their purchases, but there was still a lingering energy in the air. The sales associate returned with a velvet box, carefully opening it to present the necklace Sandra selected. Sandra studied it for a moment before glancing at Keanu, a subtle smile playing on her lips. "You think it suits me?" Keanu smirked, crossing his arms. "Bullock, everything suits you." Sandra chuckled, shaking her head. The employees who had previously ignored her now stood at full attention, ready to assist her with impeccable professionalism. Sandra noticed but didn't comment. She was used to this kind of shift in behavior. With calm confidence, she handed over her card and finalized the purchase. She never had to say anything to prove her worth. Her silence was her most powerful response, and that was the real blow to Margaret. Margaret finally stopped walking. She found herself standing in front of another luxury boutique, but she wasn't looking at the jewelry in the window. Her own reflection stared back at her, and she didn't like what she saw. She had never really thought about her actions. She never needed to. She had always been surrounded by people who shared her values, who laughed at her sharp comments, who reinforced the idea that money and image were the only things that mattered. But now, for the first time, she saw herself differently. What happened in that store made her realize something painful. She wasn't respected. She was feared. And there's a huge difference between the two. Keanu and Sandra didn't fear her. They didn't react with anger or try to put her down. They simply showed, without needing to say it outright, that she never had the power she thought she did. And that was the biggest humiliation of her life. Margaret took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. The truth stung, but at the same time she felt something she didn't expect. Relief. Because deep down she was tired of the mask, tired of playing a role that never truly fulfilled her. Maybe it was time to change. Hours later, Margaret sat in her car, still holding her phone. She had opened the app multiple times, but she didn't know what to say. Finally, she took a deep breath and started typing. "Today I learned that you can buy a diamond, but you can't buy class. Thank you, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, for this lesson." She hesitated for a moment. Then, without overthinking, she pressed post. She didn't know what kind of response to expect, but for the first time, she didn't care. Maybe this was the beginning of something different. Maybe for the first time she would actually learn. The phone screen went dark. But the comment that truly caught her off guard was one she didn't expect. The first step to change is recognizing where we went wrong. She reread that sentence. Change. She'd never thought about it before, never believed she needed to change. But now, for the first time, she wondered, what if? What if, instead of seeing this as a hit to her ego, she saw it as an opportunity? What if, instead of ignoring what happened, she actually learned from it? Margaret didn't have the answer, but for the first time, she wanted to find it. Margaret sat there, watching Sandra disappear into the crowd. She felt something strange, something unfamiliar, relief. She still didn't know what it meant, but she knew that in that instant she made a different choice than she would have before. And maybe, just maybe, this was the true beginning of change. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She could easily just go back to her life, return to her world of luxury and exclusivity, pretend none of this happened. Or she could do something different. She opened Instagram again. This time, there was no hesitation. She started typing, "I've learned that class has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with character. I'm still figuring out who I am beyond what I own, but I know I want to be better, not for status, but for myself." She read the words, hesitating for only a second. Then she took a deep breath and pressed post. The notifications started rolling in within seconds. Likes, shares, comments. But Margaret didn't need to read them to know that this post meant more than anything she'd ever shared before. Because this time, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was a truth that, finally, she was ready to admit. She didn't know if this change would be permanent, but she knew that for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. And maybe that's enough to begin. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.